Welcome. I'm Kathleen Marie, and this is Lake Country Currents. Have you ever been interested in history? History of Lake Minnetonka, or history of Minnesota, or even of our heritage? Well, this show is going to touch on a lot of those things, and I'm glad you're here to watch. Our first guest this evening is a gentleman who has, in fact, a lot of history from this area. He's been born and raised in the Minnetonka area. And I met him through the Lake Minnetonka Lakeshore Owners Association Minnetonka Memories social event. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guest, Chuck Parton.
Thanks, Kathleen. Nice to be here.
One of the main reasons why you're here today, though, is to introduce one of those guests from that particular Minnetonka Memories program. Would you like to say a little bit about our guest?
I would like to. One of the benefits, folks, of being part of this is to meet some very interesting people. I have been very blessed to do that. And this year, Minnetonka Memories, we had a number of people in the show, one who was fascinating. His name is Arlo Hasse. Arlo, you will meet in just a minute or two. He is a Caucasian who has been adopted by the Indian people and probably knows more about Indian heritage than almost anybody I've ever known. He will talk tonight about his memories as he did at Minnetonka Memories 3. He was the first person in the show, and he began with our Indian heritage way back in the 1800s.
Well, let's bring him on. Let's have some conversation with him.
Let's
That'll
do
be nice.
that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome, Arlo. It's really nice to have you on the show so that you can share a lot of these things with us. And now, is it correct that I say you are an adopted member of the Midwakantwa Dakota Indian tribe?
That is correct.
That's a long word. It took me practice to get that correct. Well, tell us, just to start with, how did you get all of this information? How are you so knowledgeable about all of these things to do with the Indians and the Indian treaties and so on?
Well, I found my first stone projectile point, what everybody would commonly call an arrowhead, when I was 9 years old, and I've never stopped looking, and I'm just about 67 now.
Oh.
So I did have the largest private collection of Indian artifacts in the whole upper Midwest, which I have sold to the tribe, and they're going to build a cultural center to house my collection.
Interesting.
So I'm looking forward to when that opens up.
And this collection, do you have this collection all laid out in numbered and so on as to where it was discovered? Or?
Yes, I have cataloged. Since I sold it, I've been busy cataloging for over a year and a half, and I've cataloged well over 10,000 pieces, and I have about 1,000 more to go.
Yeah, interesting. Well, tell us some more things that your connection here.
Well, over the years, as I grew older, I've had inordinate luck in finding the stone tools of these prehistoric people. The elderly Indians have a saying for me: you couldn't have all these things if you weren't meant to have them. Mm-hmm. And I believe that thoroughly, because I can walk into a field of 2-foot-tall alfalfa and stop after 150 feet, and there'll be a projectile point laying to be picked up. Oh. And most people spend a lifetime finding one.
Amazing.
And I've spent many an afternoon where I've found 35, 40 complete pieces in one afternoon.
Ah, that's a real spiritual thing,
but
isn't it?
At least with me, you cannot stay interested in the inanimate, the tools of a people, without eventually becoming interested in the animate, the people themselves.
Yes.
And I started attending functions that were open to the public, and pretty soon I'd get asked to come. And then I was definitely told to start getting a costume together because they wanted me to dance. Now, this is 30-some years ago.
Mm-hmm. Is that the costume you wore at Minnetonka
Yes.
Memories?
Yes.
That was beautiful. In fact, we have a picture of that, and if we can show that right now, I'll show you the clip. Tell us some more.
Well, after years of just staying in the background, I became a confidant of a lot of the Indian people, and especially the Norman Crooks, who used to be the tribal chairman at the Shakopee Prior Lake. And I don't think he ever called me anything but Brother Arlo at all times. That was just always his salutation to me, was Brother Arlo. And he and his brother Amos and Glenn Crooks, Amos's son, were very instrumental in adopting me in 1977. In 1976, they had awarded me my first eagle feather, and in 1977, at a ceremony that you could not arrange with 1,000 technicians, I was adopted and given my Indian name and told from this day on, you are one of us, and have been treated that way ever since. And I was just awarded my second eagle feather about 4 months ago.
Interesting. What does it mean, an eagle feather? What does that represent?
Well, the eagle is very symbolic to virtually all Indian people because it can fly virtually effortlessly, and it's got the keenest eyesight of any bird, so it's a very strong symbol to the Indian people.
Okay.
And the name they gave me is very appropriate, Wahinkpeo de Wichashta, which means man who looks for arrows.
Ah. That's a long name. Does anyone call you that?
Some of the elderly do. Right.
Is there a nickname for it?
No, I'm still Arlo.
Interesting. Well, I know you have some really good things to talk about as far as the language that we share with the Indians and a lot of the customs and things. Can you talk on those?
Certainly. Want me to do that right now?
Sure.
All right. Well, when I speak to a group, when I speak to about 100 groups a year, last year I spoke to 106 different groups last year alone, I lead them on by asking a couple basic questions. How many of you have had any direct contact with the Indian culture? And if I'm speaking to 100 people, if I'm lucky if I get 2 hands to go up. How many of you speak any Indian languages or Indian words? And I'll usually get somebody will raise their hand and say how. They've been watching television. That's the only Indian word they think they know. And the third question, how many of you took a bath or shower in the last week? And then they think I'm pulling their leg because they didn't respond to the first 2 just to get them to respond, but it's just as important as the first 2. And then the fourth question, how many of you have any knowledge of what the treaties said or how they came about that so-called purchased all this land we enjoy today and call ours in south central Minnesota? And that's where I draw an absolute blank every time.
Of course. Of course.
I mean, isn't that ridiculous when we've lived 150, 60 years with these treaties and nobody knows what's in them?
It is ridiculous, that's
Yes,
for sure.
Absolutely. So I know what I have to do. I always consider myself one of the luckiest human beings in the world because I can freely move in 2 cultures, the white culture and the Indian culture. And I hope I can keep doing what I'm doing till the day I die.
Well, you do it well. Tell us, when we were talking earlier, you were saying some of the Indian names of places and things
Okay.
around here.
Well, I'm going to start out with the first question. How many of you had any direct contact with the Indian culture? Are you going to eat Thanksgiving dinner in
Yes.
November? Are you going to eat turkey for Thanksgiving?
Of course, and that's
Right.
Indian.
You going to eat any potatoes for Thanksgiving?
Sweet potatoes.
Even the regular potato,
Sure.
what everybody calls the Irish potato. It was developed by the American Indians when
Really?
it went over to the Ireland during the famine in Ireland, but was never developed in Ireland.
For heaven's sakes. Interesting.
You can eat any kind of corn or beans for Thanksgiving.
You bet.
You can eat sweet potatoes, or
Yes.
you can eat cranberries. You can eat tomatoes. Did you ever eat chocolate? Did you ever eat tapioca? Did you ever eat a pineapple? Did you ever take an aspirin? Did you ever chew chewing gum?
An aspirin, is that part of Indian culture?
Absolutely.
How is that?
Because they developed the ingredients that are in common aspirin.
Oh, my goodness.
Oil of wintergreen, sassafras, or many other medicinal plants are developed by the Indian people. And this is what riles me so much all the time, is because most people don't.
We don't know that.
I don't want to sit here and say you should know, but in my opinion, you should know. And because our history books just do a terrible job of acknowledging how much of our culture, what we call our culture today, we have usurped from the Indian people. And then we somehow have a hard time giving them credit for all the things we have taken from them and call our culture today. And the second question, how many of you speak any Indian languages? And I was going to say maybe 1 or 2 will raise their hands. Did the rest of you not ever say Minnesota or North Dakota or South Dakota or Iowa or Wisconsin or Kansas or Nebraska or Miami or the cities around here, Shakopee, Chaska, Chanhassen, Waconia, Mississippi, Minnetonka. Do you ever say any of those words?
Every day.
You all say them. In fact, you say thousands of Indian words every day and fail to realize it, because what do we do with those words today? We call them all English. They're no more English than French is. But we taken it, combined it with what we speak, and most of the words the whole world uses today because they're the English that they speak here in North America. How many of you ever said okay to somebody?
All the time.
You realize every time you're saying okay to somebody, you're speaking the words the Choctaw elders always used in council. When they just agreed with what they had discussed, their assent was okay, which meant we agree, we can proceed. Isn't that exactly what it means when you tell it to somebody today? Okay, you just agreed with what he told you.
Yes.
Okay?
Is there an Indian dictionary?
Yes, there's a Indian Dakota, there's a Dakota Indian, several, but the Dakota language is a very, very hard language to learn by yourself. You almost have to be immersed in it. I wish I could speak it fluently. I can understand most of it and speak quite a bit of it, but not to carry on a conversation, because my advice to anybody, if you want to speak it, be very careful. The best way to speak it is to keep your mouth shut, because there's a male and a female way of saying the very same thing. And so many words are so similar. Like if you meet a young man, a young boy, and you want to pay him an extreme compliment, you would call him a sunka, which is my little brother. But if you call him a shunka, you're calling him a dog. So unless you know it well,
That's right.
you're far better off saying nothing.
Nothing.
Because you can, instead of complimenting somebody, you can be calling them something very disgraceful. And there's many other combinations like that.
Well, now, the third question you said you asked people is if they take a bath. If
Yes.
they took a bath, now, does that have anything to do with the Indians?
Absolutely.
How?
Because do you realize that 200 years ago, if you took a bath without a physician's prescription to do so in the city of Boston, you could be immediately put in prison?
No, I didn't know that.
Your European ancestors at that time period thought it was so unhealthy to bathe that in Boston, if you took a bath without a physician's prescription, you could be immediately put in prison. Why are all the portraits of the old European aristocrats' faces always heavy white powder? You certainly must have noticed that in the portraits of these people. For only one reason, to cover up the dirt.
Oh,
And the odor.
They invented perfume at the same time. Do you want to know why?
my God, I didn't live then.
So, the plagues that swept through Europe.
Of course.
Plagues are carried by fleas and lice.
Sure.
Clean people don't have fleas and lice.
That's right.
So how did the plague spread? Because the Europeans didn't believe in washing or bathing at that time period. Most American Indians bathed virtually every morning.
In the lakes.
Who are you emulating when you take that bath or shower we so take for granted that start our day off every morning today? Your European ancestry or your Native American adopted ancestry?
Sure. Wow.
Would you like to go back to not ever taking a bath? I can't imagine.
I'll stick with you.
So we have, like I said, basically usurped so much of their culture and call it our own. And that would be just fine if we turn around once and give credit for it. But that's what we keep failing to do. We still like to think of the Indian as the savage, and you'll learn very quickly by the time I'm through tonight that the word savage was on the wrong side.
And the treaties now, that was the last question you asked
Right.
your people.
And that's where I draw an absolute blank, because the history books say in 1805, 1837, 1851, these treaties were signed, and the government always bought more acreage from the eastern Dakota, basically the Mid-Wakantas, and make you believe that the Dakotas got paid for it. I make a standing offer to every adult group I speak to. If anybody in that room has land to sell, be it a half acre to 10,000 acres, I will buy it sight unseen that afternoon or that evening, with only one stipulation. They have to give me the same terms for their land that the government gave the Dakota for their land. And I'll never
No
have to buy
sale
land.
then.
Because nobody would be foolish enough. And the sad part is, the Dakotas always did what they were asked to do. Well, hold this for me for just a
I
minute.
sure will.
This book is a copy of every treaty ever signed by the North American Indians in the United States government. United States government has an absolutely impeccable record. They broke every one. They broke every one.
How many treaties are in there?
Hundreds, hundreds, hundreds. And the sad part is that most of them were written to be broken. That's what the intent of the treaty was. So
You said something shocking at Minnetonka Memories about a $200,000 purchase that was changed, the decimal point was changed. Mention that, if you will.
well, in 1805, Zebulon Pike came up the Mississippi River with the express purpose sent by the government to acquire 2 sites from the Mid-Wakantawa, Dakota. He was to acquire a 9 square mile site where the, on this river from Wisconsin, why can't I think of it?
St. Croix?
St. Croix River comes into the Mississippi, and another site 9 miles on each side of the Mississippi River from the Falls of St. Anthony to the mouth of the Minnesota River. So it would more than likely include where we're sitting right now. He was to buy this from the Dakota, and part of the treaty was that they would get so much money, and he kept telling them they would get $200,000 for this tract of land. And there's 2 very important articles in that treaty that are still applicable today. Article 2, in consideration of the above grants, the United States shall, prior to taking possession thereof, pay to the Sioux $2,000. Prior to taking possession thereof. Remember those words. Article 3, the United States promise on their part to permit the Sioux to pass, repass, hunt, or make other uses of the said districts as they have formerly done without any other exception. This is what we're hearing about northern Minnesota right now, Lake Mille. The treaty says they have the right to do that. These people were illiterate people, but they weren't stupid people. They retained something when they sold their land to have a way of making a living. Well, after days of treating with them, explaining this $200,000 to them and how much better off they would be with the Great White Father providing so much of their needs, he finally got 1.5 Indians to sign the document.
1.5 Indians.
1.5 Indians. Little Crow, the grandfather of the latter-day Little Crow, and Weyagoanaji was a son of Pinachot, a French trader. He was a half-breed. They were the only 2, one full-blooded Indian, one half-breed, that ever agreed to sell these tracts of land for $200,000. But when he sent the treaty back to Congress to be ratified, he very conveniently left the dollar amount blank. And when Congress ratified it, they filled in $2,000.
Says it right there.
Right. This is always the final version, but that's not what he told them out in the field. See? Price was reduced from $200,000, and he could only get 1.5 signatures at that price, and we call this a valid treaty. Then we come to 1837. Now the government wanted all of the Dakota's land east of the Mississippi River and all the islands therein. And the government knew they couldn't treat Dakota Indians like they did the first time, changed the document completely, so they took 26 chiefs to Washington. And they were under the assumption that within 2 weeks they'd be back home again. But the government applied the process of intimidation, just you can't believe, because what they did is paraded the West Point candidates in front of them for days to show them how many soldiers the Great White Father had and what weapons those soldiers had. And the days became weeks, the weeks became months, and after almost 4 months in Washington, D.C., they said, we want to go home and see our families. If you haven't done your business that you want to do with us by now, we want to go home. And when the first Dakota was allowed to speak to the commission, the question was, where was the money the Great White Father had promised us from the last treaty they had signed? This was 1837. Would you sell land that you bought in 1805 and still not be paid for it 32 years later, the lousy $2,000? And the treaty clearly says in this 3rd article, there shall be no development on that land till it is paid for. When was Fort Snelling built? In 1819. Another clear violation of the treaty, because the government hadn't paid them the $2,000, but they went right ahead and built Fort Snelling. So the treaties are just are miserable documents. And the Dakota finally said they would not get off the steamboat on the way back until they were paid the $2,000. Then the government finally capitulated and paid them the $2,000 for the 1805 treaty in 1837.
Pretty good terms and conditions,
Pretty
weren't
good,
they?
but they keep getting worse. They keep getting worse. Then we come to the two main treaties that really apply directly to this area. The ones that traverse the Sioux, and I don't know how many of you gone down Highway 169 lately. Just before you get to St. Peter, it's Traverse des Sioux. It's the area where the Minnesota River was very shallow and it had a hard, rocky bottom, where the Dakota constantly crossed the river at that point, and the French gave it, of course, the word Traverse des Sioux. And I should back up quite a bit at this point. These are the people that I'm talking about, the Dakota people that everybody, including every document they ever signed, referred to as the Sioux Indians. And there's no word in their vocabulary that even resembles that word. None. But we go back to the 13 original colonies who brought the gun. Just west of there, the colonies, was the Iroquois nation, who very quickly acquired the white man's gun from the early settlers. They then became dominant over the Ojibwe people, and because they were forced to migrate westward, the Ojibwe, they acquired the white man's gun from the French traders in Quebec and Montreal. By the time they got to Wisconsin and Minnesota, they had the gun, and the Dakota did not. So the Dakota and the Ojibwe were deadly enemies for about 200 years. Deadly enemies. The Ojibwe referred to the Dakota Indians as the Nadawisi Indians, which in their language translates to like unto an adder. The French came into this area very quickly after the Ojibwe did, and saw all these Indians that Ojibwe referred to as the Nadawisi, and they gave it the French pluralization and called them the Nadawi Sioux. And over the years, the Nadawi has been dropped and they've become the Sioux Indians. And there's no word in their vocabulary that even resembles that word. And in fact, it's a very derogatory term. You're literally calling them a snake, because the word Nadawisi means like unto an adder in Ojibwe, or a snake. At this time, the Dakota were the most dominant, land-dominating group of people in what's today the United States. They controlled all of western Wisconsin, northern Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and eastern Montana. There were 7 major bands in the Dakota Nation: the Teton, the Yankton, the Yanktonai, the Sistaton, the Wahpeton, the Wahpekutans, and the Midwakantwas. And I'm anglicizing all those names because in the strictest of Dakota pronunciation, they come out different. Each one of those tribes can virtually all be broken down into 7 sub-tribes. Like in the Teton, you have the Sans Arcs, the Miniconjou, the Unkpapa, the Blackfoot, the Brule, the Two Kettle, and I'm still always talking about the same people. The Ojibwe, when they had the gun, were able to drive them out of Wisconsin and northern Minnesota. So today we have 7 reservations of Ojibwe in northern Minnesota, and still have 4 reservations of Dakota in south central Minnesota. And when I ask most people how close they think they are to the closest reservation, they talk about 100, 200 miles, and it's just on the other side of Shakopee. Most people, until the gambling took over strong, most people didn't know there was a reservation there at all, because they quietly minded their own business and caused no trouble.
Is that where the reservation is right by the gambling casino?
Yes. Yeah, well, in several segments, they've bought a lot of land the last couple of years. And they've really had to learn how to branch out, because they're prospering very, very well. But I've never seen them lasso a single person and drag them through the door and say, now you got to play the slots tonight, or you got to they all walk in willingly. And it's basically poetic justice. They're finally getting some of the white man's money back that they didn't get in the first place. But then we come to the treaty at 1851, July 23rd, between the Sisseton and Wahpeton Dakota. And again, that was deliberately done by the government. The last 4 of these 7 bands collectively are known as the Santee Dakota, the eastern 4 bands. So the government picked on the 2 western of the 4 eastern bands because they were not as acculturated as the other 2 tribes were, the Midwakantwa and the Wapekutes. In this treaty, they bought 24 million acres of the Dakota's land, 19,500,000 in southern Minnesota, 3 million in northern Iowa, and 1,750,000 in eastern South Dakota. Again, after days of treating with the Dakota, they told him they would pay him $1,665,000 for this 24 million acres of land. They would pay them $305,000 down, which they were to get $275,000 for moving and living 1 year and to settle their affairs. And that little word there, settle their affairs, was the kicker in this thing. And $30,000 for schools, mills, blacksmith shop, fence, and so forth. The balance of $1,360,000 was to be put in safe and profitable stocks, 5% interest to be paid thereon for a period of 50 years, and at the end of 50 years, the entire principal and interest would be satisfied. Now let's go over that treaty. To settle their affairs, there is no way in the world that Dakota would have ever sold all this land to the government willingly. So the government made a pact with the white traders. Extend credit to the Dakota Indians, extend all the credit they ever asked for, but you must convince them how much better off they would be, that they would never be starving again, they would always have blankets, they would always have this and that, if they sold their land to the great white father, how well he would take care of his children. Biggest con job that ever took place in this country. Because the traders then were told, if you are successful, submit bills to the government to what the Dakota owes you. Don't bother to tell us who owes you what. Don't bother to tell us who owes you for what. Just give us a lump sum figure that you say the Dakota owe you. But you must convince them to sell their land. The traders were successful in convincing them that the great white father would take care of them. And the treaty said $305,000 to be paid down. When they were asked to sign the treaty, they were asked to sign the original treaty after it was read to them in English and in Dakota. Then they were asked to sign a second copy, and they were very carefully told it was a duplicate of the first. And then they were drawn aside and asked to sign a third copy, except the third copy was a completely different document, which was never explained to the Dakota people. And it assigned their entire down payment over to the white traders. In fact, far more than their down payment, because the figures come out to this. Remember, they were to receive so much down, the rest to be put in safe and profitable stocks, and 5% interest to be paid thereon annually for 50 years, and that the entire principal and interest would be satisfied. Well, the money never was, the unpaid balance was never put in safe and profitable stocks. The 10 years it was paid, it was voted directly out of the general treasury each year. So again, another violation of the treaty. And the traders submitted claims. The traders' claims, according to statements later made by Governor Ramsey under oath, totaled $431,758.78. Their down payment was only $305,000. But this sum was later scaled down by a committee of traders, their own traders, McLeod, Brown, and Roberts, to bring them within the amount limited in the treaty. Finally left at $210,000 for the Indians and $40,000 for a group of half-breeds. Some notable examples of this reduction are Bailey and Dowsman submitted a claim to the government of $43,122. It was reduced to $15,000. Sibley, as agent for the American Fur Company, submitted a claim of $144,000. Oh, that's the one I just read. From 44,984, it was reduced to 66,459. J.B. Faribault from 33,000 to 22,005. Alexander Faribault from 18,000 to 13,500. And Mackenzie, as assignee of the Ewing Fur Interest, submitted a claim of $57,175. It was reduced to $5,500, and not one of them complained. Talk about kiting your accounts. Governor Ramsey was instrumental in getting this. He then appointed a friend of his, Hugh Tyler from the state of Pennsylvania, power of attorney, to distribute this money to the Indian people. His fee alone was $37,500 of the Dakota's down payment.
As the distributor.
Just for distributing the money. Can you imagine what a kickback Governor Ramsey must have got out of that deal?
Is this book you're reading from, is that something that people could find in a library?
Yes, it's
What is the name of it?
Old Traverse de Sioux. There are 4 eyewitness accounts of the Treaty of Traverse de Sioux, and everything that was said is in this book.
Interesting.
And it's a very hard book to get a hold of because it's been out of print, but it has been reproduced by Ross and Haynes in a new, nicely bound book. But I have 2 of the old originals. But they get worse. Their down payment was gone before the ink was even dry on the document. The money was never put in safe and profitable stocks. Can you do second-grade arithmetic? Okay. If you put your money in safe and profitable stocks, at that time you probably could get 6 to 7% interest on it. You paid the Dakota 5% interest, and the treaty says at the end of 50 years the entire principal and interest shall be satisfied. There is no provision in the treaty whatsoever to ever pay another penny of the principal. So you put your money in the bank, pay them 5%. At the end of 50 years, you still have all your money in the bank, and you have all their land. You got land to sell?
You'll buy.
I'll
Same
buy.
terms and conditions.
Same terms the
Yes.
government gave the Dakota Indians. There was no intent ever to pay another penny of the $1,360,000 they owed to Dakota. Pay them 5% interest for 50 years, and at the end of 50 years, the entire principal and interest would be satisfied. That's the way all the treaties are written. They were meant to cheat, to lie, to steal. They assumed they were dealing with illiterate savages, but they were dealing with human beings, and never could see to treat them that way. So, 2 weeks later, a similar treaty was signed at Mendota, where the government purchased another 11 million acres of the Dakota's land. So in those 2 treaties, within 2 weeks, they bought 35 million of the Dakota's land, acres of the Dakota's land. One of the main parts of that treaty was that the Dakota would retain the first 2 tribes, the Sisseton and Wahpeton, were to retain a strip of land 10 miles on each side of the Minnesota River, starting at the South Dakota border at Browns Valley, 70 miles down the river. That was left to the first people who had inhabited 24 million acres. 2 weeks later, they signed a treaty for another 11 million acres, and they were left a strip 10 miles on each side of the river for another 70 miles. So all the Dakota who had previously inhabited 35 million acres of land were somehow supposed to subsist on a strip of land 20 miles by 140 miles long. Absolutely an impossibility. Absolutely impossible. So what had happened is they became total wards of the federal government. Their entire lifestyle depended on that 5% interest. Then we come to 1862. Now the United States was in the Civil War, and one of the main ingredients the Dakota waited for was that gold that came each year with part of the annuity, the 5% interest. The United States was in the Civil War, they didn't have the gold, or at least the priority of the Indian people wasn't their priority, so the gold didn't get sent that year. The food, the blankets, the clothing, everything was in the warehouse of the annuity except the gold. It was over 2 months beyond the date of the treaty when the gold should have been there, the distribution should have been taken place. The Dakota were still waiting to get the food, and their children were starving to death. When they went to Andrew Myrick, the government Indian agent at the time at Lower Sioux, his reply was, and this is the most terrible thing, his reply to the Dakota was, if your children are hungry, let them go eat grass. And there's a very important part of that quote that very seldom gets added to it and quoted, or let them eat their own dung. Now, if you were waiting to get your money, which was due you 2 months ago by treaty, and you still hadn't received it, and somebody gave you an inhumane answer like that when you begged for, well, at least release the food so our children don't have to starve to death. And he told them, if your children are hungry, let them go eat grass or let them eat their own dung. And the culmination of that was a group of young Dakota then went to Little Crow and asked him to lead them in battle because so many of the white men were off to the south fighting the Civil War. And they figured if they couldn't regain some of their country now, they'd never have an opportunity like it again. They went to Little Crow and he counseled them, you are like the dogs in the hot sun. You run around in circles, you know not what you do. Because Little Crow had been to Washington, D.C. several times, and he had seen the might of the Great White Father's soldiers and their weapons. And he says, you are like the dogs in the hot sun. You run around in circles, you know not what you do. You cannot win a war with the Great White Father's soldiers. Their reply then was, if Little Crow is a coward, we will get somebody else to lead us. His response was, Little Crow is not a coward, I will lead you, knowing what the ultimate result would be.
No chance.
No chance. They didn't have a chance in the world. So we have what the history books call the Dakota, or the Sioux Massacre.
Uprising, was it called?
Sioux Uprising, right. The Dakota do not call it that. They call it the Dakota Conflict. And it was fathers who were doing just like any father would do today. If you came home tonight and some stranger was sitting in your living room watching your television and told you to get, and you're not going to get a dime for everything you've got here, it's not mine, what would you do?
Very upset.
And you
Take
do
action,
something.
you
Right.
bet.
That's all the Dakota did too. And for that, they got beaten that there was really practically no recovery for a long time. Many were taken captives. Many, including Little Crow, fled to Canada. And the elderly men and women and the children and the friendlies were put in a stockaded compound right down here at Fort Snelling again, over 1,300. And over 300 died the first winter from lack of blankets and proper food. In the spring, they were loaded onto a steamboat, taken down the Mississippi, up to Missouri, to Nebraska, and put on a reservation that was so worthless. The water couldn't be drank, no crops could be grown. And again, hundreds died before they were moved from there. Ones that were taken captive by the government soldiers were brought before Sibley in field trials. No trial took more than 10 minutes. All it took was for one individual to say, I saw him at one of the major battles. And Sibley found him guilty and condemned him to be hung. When Abraham Lincoln saw all these names come across his desk of Dakota men who were to be hung, he asked for the trial transcripts, and he could see no reason why any other than 39 Indian men had done anything that merited hanging. So he commuted the hanging. They were sent to prison, but they at least weren't hung. One more was commuted later, and the day after Christmas in 1862, 38 brave Dakota men were hung from a common scaffold right across from the library in what's Mankato, Minnesota today. And their bodies were buried right on the riverbank. And I'll give you another shocker. That same evening, the Mayo brothers were there with their medical students from Rochester to dig up as many of these human corpses as they could to take back to Rochester for study purposes in their anatomy classes.
Whoa.
Why don't your history books tell you that?
Why?
Today we think of the Mayo brothers as some of the most noble human beings that ever lived in the state, right? But they thought nothing of digging up these hung Indians. Little Crow and as part of his band fled to Canada. A year later, a father and son from Hutchinson were coming home. They had been to town, and they saw these Indians out in their pasture picking wild raspberries. And they, of course, they were Indians. Today we can get all excited about a wolf bounty in northern Minnesota exterminating a species, right? So we no longer pay bounties on wolves. But are you aware that the state of Minnesota at this time paid $200 bounty on Dakota scalps? Didn't make a bit of difference if it was a week-old baby or a 90-year-old grandmother. If you killed that Indian, this state that we so revere as our state, paid $200 bounty. Well, the Lamsons, all they could see was $200 for each one of these Indians. So they got their guns and started shooting, and they killed the elderly, who happened to be Little Crow. They killed him, but they didn't know who they had killed, but they couldn't contain themselves. They had to go to Hutchinson and brag that they were going to get $200. His son escaped. They had buried his body in the offal pile, which, if you were speaking today in language as a butcher, it would be the intestines and everything from the butchering process. But in that time, it probably was a manure pile. And when they went to Hutchinson, they told people about the deformed wrists in this Indian they had just killed. And the Hutchinson people realized it was Little Crow, because as a young man, he had been accidentally shot through both of his wrists, and both wrists were deformed all his life. So they went and dug him out again, put him on the main street of Hutchinson. This was happened to be the 4th of July, and the Hutchinson kids had the time of their life putting firecrackers in his nose, his ears, his mouth, and all other bodily openings, and shooting off the firecrackers in the body of Little Crow.
Now, where is that information from? I mean, where do you acquire that kind of information?
I own over 1,300 books on the Indian cultures alone. My library is one of the most extensive on the Indian people.
Will your library also be available in
I
this?
still have too much to do with it. Eventually it will be.
Will be.
Eventually it will go back to the people also, yes. But see, throughout all this process, even having a bounty on their heads, we called them the savages. Think about it. Well, anyhow, the Lamsons weren't paid $200 bounty. They were paid $500 because it was Little Crow. And if that wasn't bad enough, then his bones were gathered together and put on public display in the State Historical Society in St. Paul for almost 150 years. You could go down there and see the bones of Little Crow.
Oh, really?
Till they were finally reclaimed by the Wakeman family, who are direct descendants of Little Crow, and he's properly buried in South Dakota today.
And the family shot them because they were eating raspberries.
That's right, and they were Indians.
Arlo, you made a comment earlier about there were no human beings except Indians. Would you explain that to the audience?
Well, a common history book in the state of Minnesota. I brought one along. This is a later one, but the one that preceded this one told the story of the homesteader, white homesteader, who took the steamboat as far as Carver, Minnesota, and because of the time of the year, the water was low in the rapids, he could go no further, so he got off and walked to Chaska and filed his land claim, and carrying his broadaxe, he proceeded to fell trees, shape the logs, and build his log cabin. And then the book went on to say for 2 years he didn't see another human being, but he saw lots of Indians. That was a common Minnesota textbook for elementary school students. For 2 years he didn't see another human being, but he saw lots of Indians. This one, you'd think, could possibly be written in 1850, where in fact it's copyrighted in 1950. Tells the story of the Ojibwe ladies gathering wild rice. When the canoe was filled, they dug a pit on shore, paddled ashore, and poured about a half bushel of rice in this pit, and they had forked sticks on each side with a cross stick. A male Indian would step into this pit barefoot and thrash the rice, the hulls off the rice with his feet.
Let me
Will you
read
read
what
that
this
last
says.
sentence? See,
It says,
it's a very nice narrative up till then, but they can't leave things alone yet. They had to add a very derogatory sense. Now listen to this.
so here's the adult Indian stamping the rice. It says, strange to say, this was always done by a man, and some say that this is the only kind of work which a male Indian was ever known to do.
Oh.
That's copyrighted in 1950. Say, today we no longer say these openly derogatory things in our textbooks, but we still can't make that other necessary step to say the good things about these people. But we turn around and live so much of their lifestyle and culture and call it our own. But we can't acknowledge any goodness in these people at all. They're still always the savage Indians. We made them savage, if they ever were, by lying, cheating, and stealing from them everything they had. But those were actual textbooks. The Cherokee Indians, nobody ever wanted to be accepted more than the Cherokee Indians of the Carolinas. They realized to be accepted, they had to wear the clothing the white man did, so they did. They realized to be accepted, they had to live in log cabins like the white man did, so they built log cabins. They realized to be accepted, they had to become adept farmers, and they became some of the best farmers in the Carolinas. But it was their downfall because now the whites coveted their land because it was such well-tended farms. They realized to be accepted, they had to become literate, they had to learn to read and write. So one Cherokee named Sequoia built a small log cabin on the very edge of the reservation and spent almost 5 years in total seclusion. And in that time he put the Cherokee language, now this was an illiterate man himself, he had never been to school, but he put the Cherokee language into an alphabet and the alphabet into a written language, and in less than 2 years over 90% of the Cherokee learned to read and to write. They published a weekly newspaper, they published the Bible in Cherokee, And when the whites wanted their land, Andrew Jackson signed the documents that forced them to walk from Carolinas to Oklahoma in the dead of winter, not in the spring or the fall or summer, but in the dead of winter, where over 60% died before they got there. Again, a simple policy of annihilation. How many will die? They could have put them on steamboats, taken them out there, but they put them walking, the infamous Trail of Tears. Over 60% died before they got there. Captain Jack, who was chief of the Modoc Indians of California, like the Cherokees, wanted to be accepted. And he finally ended up killing 2 military men. And he and his band fled to the lava beds of Northern California, the most inhospitable, worthless land in the United States. They weren't satisfied to leave him there. They brought in the military to dislodge him and couldn't. They brought in howitzers and blasted him out of the lava beds. And when he surrendered, they hung him. Then they skun him. And then they tanned his hide. And then they sent it back to Washington, D.C. and put it on public display, the tanned hide of Captain Jack. And for 13 cents, you could file by and see the tanned hide of Captain Jack. Now, what do you think would happen if we did that to a world leader today? Skin him, tan his hide, and put it on public display for 13 cents.
Arlo, may I ask you a question?
Certainly.
You're making a great difference in behalf of the Indians. Who else cares? I care, we all care listening, but who else really cares?
25 years ago, if I was asked to speak on this subject 10 times a year, I was lucky. Last year I was asked to speak 106 times. So the people are slowly saying, hey, something's wrong with our history books. Something's wrong with our history books. And they want to know what the facts actually were, because the history books tell you in all these, the land was purchased. Well, if you never pay for it or don't ever intend to pay for it, how can it be purchased? But we purchase land today in Minnesota, and the first thing you do is take your abstract to a title insurance company of some kind and have them check it out to make sure there's no clouds in your abstract, right? And who's the first signature? Abraham Lincoln. And he's selling stolen ground. But we pretend nothing happened prior to that signature of Abraham Lincoln's. Probably more happened prior to it than has happened since. But we keep closing our eyes and pretending nothing happened. And that first signature is selling stolen land, because the Indians never got paid for it. Because they were paid the 5% interest for 10 years, and with the outbreak, the government arbitrarily canceled all the rest of the interest payments as well. But something else happened prior to that. Remember that strip 10 miles on each side of the river for 140 miles? In 1858, for some unknown reason, Congress, well, I got to show you something. Oops, hope this doesn't disrupt us too much. But the Treaty of 1851 that left them this land, when Congress ratified this, here's the third article. This is the article that left them that strip of land. What does it say?
Stricken out.
2 words. It's all it took the government to take that away from them, too. It took the government almost a year to ratify this treaty after it was signed by the Dakota. The Dakota moved to that strip of land, and when government ratified it finally, almost a year later, 2 words for the third article that left them this 20 by 140 mile strip of land, stricken out. Why? Because there were a group of very powerful Southern senators in Congress at the time, and they were afraid of another northern anti-slave state coming about in 1851. So they figured there was no way the Dakota would ever accept a treaty if they had no place to go to. The only thing is they already had gone. They were living on this strip of land because that's the treaty they had said they would do. So then we come to 1858, the government brought this up on the floor once more. Do the Dakota, in fact, really have title to this strip of land? And then they came up with the conclusion, yes, they do have title to it, but it's far more land than they really need. So let's take the 10-mile strip on the north side of the river for the full 140-mile length away from them, add a couple pennies per acre to what we already owe them, and open it up for white settlement. And that was brought about because Major Brown had married a Dakota lady and had a large ranching operation up in Browns Valley, Minnesota, on Indian land. And if he could get that 10-mile strip, he could validate his title to that land. And it made it possible. So now the Dakota were forced to live on that 10 by 140-mile strip of land. That's all they had left. They were like puppets on a string. The government could have done anything they wanted with them, to move them day after tomorrow or the day before tomorrow if they wanted to. Because the government handled it with the two words, stricken out.
Arlo, how can people that are interested in the things that you're talking about, how can they get more information? Or what would you explain for them to do to maybe help in some way?
Well, I was spoken at regular sessions of virtually every class in Dakota taught at the University of Minnesota and McAllister in the last 15 years. But there's still a lot of people who do not, or have never heard these facts.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll look at it this way. When Russia was dominated by communism and by Joseph Stalin, all the history books made Stalin a god, right? Because if you didn't, you probably weren't living the next week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when Stalin died and communism failed, the Russians have rewritten all their history books to tell the whole world what a tyrant Stalin was. If they could do it in those couple years, why has it taken us 150 plus years to rewrite our history books?
So really, it's just getting the knowledge out to people.
Absolutely.
Arlo, I think it's correct that our government has now made restitution to the Japanese people who were sequestered after Pearl Harbor, and they've compensated them now financially. Is that what you'd like to see in some way that we make do
Well,
with the Indians in
we
some way?
today have a common practice of going all over the world to tell people how to enforce human rights, what they should be doing in the enforcement of human rights. As far as I'm concerned, we have no right to tell anybody how to enforce human rights until we are men and women enough to say, but at one time, our country was probably the world's worst. Because look what we did to the Indian people. Look what we did to the black people. Look what we did to the Japanese people you just mentioned. Took them out of their businesses, out of their homes, and put them in stockaded villages. And again, the closest one was right here at Shakopee. Most people have no idea it was there. They gave up their businesses, gave up their homes for only one reason. They had slant eyes. They could be recognized. Weren't we fighting the Italians and the Germans at the same time? How many of them did we lock up? Not one.
Arlo, this has been really interesting to have you come and share all this information with us this evening. We're kind of running down on time now, and would you have some kind of concluding comment that you'd like to make?
Yes, we have to rewrite our history books and stop being afraid to name names and name places, because those are some of them are very prominent names today. But if they were SOBs in the way they treated with Indian people, the history books have to say it that way. If we step on toes, we step on toes. You'll get some reaction from this program tonight.
Well, I hope we do. And I think that the individuals that are interested in finding out more about this information should contact the LMLOA through the hotline. That hotline number is 472-9876. And if you do have any questions, if you'd like to contact Arlo personally, we can make that available and maybe find out where you're going to be speaking and let our people know that as well, so that they can come and hear you and ask you questions personally.
I have spoken to groups from Wisconsin to Iowa and all over Minnesota, and I do not make a charge. It's something I have to do.
It's definitely a mission for you.
Right.
And thank you very much for sharing it with
You're
us.
welcome.
Thank you, Arlo, very
welcome.
much.
Well, next time we're going to have some more interesting things to share too. Our show has now gone from a half an hour to an hour because we do have some really good information to share. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.